My name, again, is Far Curlin, and I will have the pleasure of moderating our plenary session now, the rest of the morning, which is devoted to the question, is medicine a spiritual vocation? Is medicine a spiritual practice, and if so, in what sense, and how might we think about that? We have a terrific lineup of speakers, three physicians who have some other areas of expertise as well, as you'll hear, as well as a sociologist, Jonathan Imber, who has spent quite a bit of time thinking about and writing about the sociology of physicians, and well, I'll tell you more about him, and he'll tell you more about that shortly. I took it as a good sign this morning that as I was enjoying one of the parallel sessions that I was a part of, the one on mental health issues, and hearing some fascinating presentations, I was also feeling a great deal of pain at not being in the other sessions. And that's not often, sometimes that's not experienced at a conference. So I took that as a good sign. I hope wherever you were that you got a lot out of what you heard, and that it stimulated on more questions and ideas for you. Let's get started. Our first speaker is Alan Astro. Dr. Astro is the director of the Division of Hematology and Medical Oncology at the Maimonides Cancer Center in Brooklyn, New York, where he has been since 2005 after 19 years at St. Vincent's Catholic Medical Center in Manhattan. He's a graduate, both undergrad and medical school of Yale. And when he was at St. Vincent's, he worked with as he puts it, his friend and colleague, Dan Sulmazy, who's also part of this morning's panel. And they ran together a conference series titled Spirituality, Religious Wisdom, and the Care of the Patient. It was a remarkable series. Some of you may have participated in some of the sessions they put together, and there's a DVD they made of that. Dr. Astro is a charter member of the Judaism, Science, and Medicine Group, founded by Chava Tirosh Samuelson. He's chair of Jewish Studies at Charter. Let's see. Oh, gotcha. Who? All right, very good. He's the physician leader of the Schwartz Rounds, an activity some of you may participate in your own centers. And if you look over his work, he's published many papers and given many talks, and been quite involved in questions about caring for patients with advanced illness and at the end of life, and specifically attending to, assessing, and responding to their spiritual needs. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Astro.
Thanks very much for just to tell you, anytime anyone comes to Maimonides Hospital, it's always the test we put everyone through. Can you say the word Maimonides? It's really, people get it, Maimonides, it's a tough word to say, but it's Moses ben Maimon, that was his name. All right, so I was recently at a dinner with a local physician and a top hospital administrator. The point of the dinner was to recruit that physician, to my hospital. As we were reviewing a number of different types of arrangements, all perfectly legal, by the way, and just in case, just in case anyone from CMS is in the audience with standard hospital lingo, this conference, where I knew I was going to have to be giving a talk, was in the back of my mind. And I remember thinking during this dinner, boy, this is pretty far from medicine as a spiritual vocation. When sometime later in the evening I offered weekly, always do what's best for the patient, I was looked at as if I were from outer space. Hospitals, at least in the New York City area these days, are under tremendous financial pressure. Anyone seen the New York Times today, there's a story about this. Physicians' incomes in many fields are decreasing, and so the temptation is strong to focus on the business side of medicine. The idea that we treat people, or better, persons, and serve communities was replaced some time ago by covered lives and markets. A patient recently underwent questionable surgery, and a nurse practitioner asked me if she thought the doctor had done it for money. The best I could answer was, I hope not. I'm a division chief, 10 attendings, 9 fellows, 8 treatment nurses, 4 NPs, 2 PAs, and a partridge in a pear tree. When I took the job, my good friend Dan Macy wondered if I really wanted to get into the universe of budgets, recruiting, market share, strategic plans, and the like. It's a question I sometimes ask myself these days. If my division doesn't hit its budget targets, I'll certainly be hearing from the hospital higher-ups. Or worse, I'll hear nothing. No one will return my calls. Our hospital is in the process of setting up a unified faculty practice plan, and my role, as I see it, is to negotiate the best deal that I can for the doctors in my group, which can definitely lead to some tense moments, i.e., department chair hangs up on you. One of the Maimonides vice presidents, a friend and supporter, knowing my interests, recently asked me to help set up an ethics consult service, and I nearly became hysterical. When do I have time to do that? So, what am I doing here, speaking on behalf of medicine as a spiritual vocation? I'm feeling like a bit of a fraud. One possibility, this is a debate, and I'm taking the opposing view. Medicine is not a spiritual vocation. It's a business, pure and simple. 18% of the GNP, $3 trillion a year and growing. All this talk about spirituality stems from the underlying meaning of the Latin root spirare, wind. Or, okay, breath, but you know what I mean. Spirituality, one might argue, is without substance, without practical import as far as how we practice medicine, except to impede the rationalization of what is in essence a service business. It is no different in principle from, say, the restaurant business, but with a different type of customer. Instead of serving diners, we serve patients, but on a larger scale and with third-party payment to cover the check. And if you have a reservation at a restaurant, they don't make you wait 2 hours for your table. And as opposed to doctors who, as we heard yesterday during the discussion section, sometimes relate to their patients as if they are no more than a disease, at a restaurant, the waiter will usually be civil to you if he wants a good tip. But most of us can see the obvious difference between medical care and other service businesses. There may be government programs to prevent people from going hungry, but certainly no right to a restaurant meal. Medicine is different because we are talking about existence itself, life and death, suffering, permanent disability. Even if a waiter gives you poor service, even if he drops your plate of food on your lap, and I've definitely seen that one, he's not going to kill you. A doctor makes a mistake, the consequences can obviously be serious. So, Alan Einthoven, intellectual father of managed competition, acknowledged in a 1993 essay, and I'll quote here, "Nobody defends the proposition that people without coverage or the money to pay should go without necessary medical care or be allowed to suffer or be disabled or die for the lack of reasonable care." Now, Einthoven clearly was unable to anticipate the 2012 Republican presidential primary debates. But the point he makes is that while there are business aspects to medical care, there are underlying societal values at stake in how we conceive of, organize, and pay for medical care. By implication, these values need explicit attention, ought to shape our approach to the larger issues of finance and governance. One might argue that the values that govern our shared instincts about access to medical care have nothing to do with spirituality, you can make that claim, but rather stem from common sense morality. You could say that. But, as we learned yesterday from Professor Ferngreen, our whole notion that care for the sick as a communal obligation, that whole notion that we have a communal obligation to care for the sick, it stems from a Christian critique of the Roman practice during epidemics where the sick were banished and allowed to die in the streets uncared for. Christians in the 3rd century organized ambulances and established hospitals, at least partly, in response to the biblical idea that we are all created in the image of God, that all human life is of value, that the human body possesses intrinsic dignity. this is a spiritual notion. So, is medicine a spiritual vocation? On at least a societal level, it appears that there is a spiritual basis for some of our attitudes toward responsibility to care for the sick, that these attitudes, at least historically, have been grounded in a sense of a relationship with a transcendent God. One might wonder if some of the bitterness over the Obama healthcare plan stems from the administration's failure to stress spiritual values in defending the law. They called it the Affordable Health Care Act, stressing efficiency and cost savings. No denying that these are crucial matters. But it is possible that a degree of public enthusiasm for the law was lost in the transition from yes, we can to bending the cost curve. Perhaps it was the idea of medicine as a spiritual vocation. It is much safer, of course, to keep public discussion on the level of the technocratic. That seems to be the sad story Daniel Kim told us yesterday in his history of the AMA's Council on Medicine and Religion, where it was impossible to find common ground in the early 1970s over the issue of abortion, or even to agree to disagree, and religion was sent packing. This conference, I see, is grounded in a greater sense of hope and possibility, a way to bring religion back in at the level of shared understanding. Dan Macy and I, as Farr mentioned, held similar hopes 12 years ago now, back in 2000, when we organized a conference series at St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan, now blessed memory, entitled Spirituality, Religious Wisdom, and the Care of the Patient. The title was actually my wife's idea. It was a moment when it seemed as if the spirit of interfaith dialogue was very much in the air. Our theory then was that much of religious thought about medicine focused on ethics, the rights and wrongs of abortion, physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, feeding tubes, in vitro fertilization, and the like. But while all these were obviously crucial matters, they were largely tangential to the day-to-day practice of medicine. For Dan and me, what seemed most important in the clinic and at the bedside was what we felt was the spiritual dimension to medical practice and care. By spiritual, we were thinking of the quality of the relationship of doctor and patient, and the values, transcendental values from our viewpoint, that underlay medical care. For patients, hope and faith, healing, dignity, gratitude, love, and their mirror opposites, anger, shame, guilt, existential despair. For doctors, love for our patients, empathy, idealistic dedication, exhilaration when treatments go well, or when we have genuine connection with our patients. And their opposites, emotional depletion, exhaustion, frustration, alienation, apathy, cynicism, and a profound sense of failure. We felt that religions had much of crucial import to say about these matters, and we held a series of case-based discussions focused on the stresses and strains of frontline patient care. We also felt that we can learn from one another, that there are strengths and weaknesses in every outlook. Revealed religion tends to see itself as holding the complete truth, which makes open-minded conversation difficult. In Judaism, the normative view is that everything one needs to know is in the Torah and its commentaries. But as a matter of practical reality, there are ways of getting around that. That's what rabbis are for. This is a topic that might properly be addressed in the breakout sessions. Much depends on the spirit of the age. The series worked more or less as we had hoped. As a place where physicians, nurses, social workers, chaplains, psychologists, and others in the healing professions could gather to reflect on their own core values and talk with one another about their own frustrations and their source of inspiration. It sounds somewhat akin to what Granger Westberg tried to do 50 years ago. Why continue these sorts of efforts now? We have moved on to a world of pay-for-performance, and the inner life of the healthcare professional does not appear to be high on the agenda of most policymakers, although the spirituality of our patients is drawing needed attention. There's good evidence from a wide range of sources that spiritual beliefs and practices are vital matters to patients who struggle with serious illness. But what about the doctor? One study showed that 28% of a survey of British oncologists had a psychiatric disorder. Based upon my own experience, that number seems low. One well-known investigator in the field of doctor-patient communication queried, why are the rates of psychiatric illness, suicide, disillusionment with work, marital disharmony, and divorce so high among doctors in comparison with other professional groups? Physician burnout is now a major concern, subject of an entire session at the upcoming annual meeting of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Depersonalization, emotional depletion, loss of empathy, these might potentially have some impact on healthcare outcomes. Patients are unhappy when their doctors appear rushed and disconnected. We heard this yesterday during the discussion section from a person with multiple myeloma who respects her physician's expertise, but is troubled that he treats her as if she is no more than a disease. But some physicians distance themselves from their patients as a form of self-protection. If they get too close, they fear that they will burn out. How to avoid burnout? Here are a few suggestions that have been made. Hobbies, friendships, more vacation time. Strongly in favor of that one, but strangely can't seem to enlist hospital administration and support. A colleague whom I greatly respect has recently written about buoyancy as counterbalance to burnout. He advises physicians to develop their own personal inventory of buoyancy factors, autonomy, exercise of skill, gratitude, courage, compassion, etc. It's a fine list and excellent common sense advice, and likely to address the ordinary degree of tension most of us experience at work. But medicine and nursing are fields where day to day we are face to face with pain, suffering, existential doubt, death. Everyone needs a vacation, but fundamentally, everything is the same when you come back. Is escapism the best answer that we can come up with? There's actually one small piece of evidence that religion may be of some value. Around 2000, Jimmy Holland's psychosocial group from Memorial Sloan Kettering did a study of burnout in an oncology unit. They found to their surprise that residents who identified religious faith as important to them were significantly less likely to act in a callous or cynical manner, to show signs of burnout. Clearly, studies of this sort need to be replicated, and it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing. But it is at least a suggestion that the inner life of the physician matters and needs attention and interest of all patients. That isn't the direction, however, that physician organizations have been going. The stress now within the world of physician education is on professionalism, with groups developing charters that attempt to define the core principles that make their field a profession. In internal medicine, we have a set of three core principles: patient welfare, patient autonomy, social justice, and 10 commitments or responsibilities: competence, honesty, patient confidentiality, etc. It's a fine document. Going back to Professor Ferngreen's talk from yesterday, this would be Hippocrates without Asclepius. But the question becomes how to achieve its worthy goals. A recent publication in JAMA, that's the Journal of the American Medical Association, from a distinguished team, including representatives from the American Board of Internal Medicine and leading academic groups, gives us a sense of where all this is heading. The central argument is found in the title, quote, "A behavioral and systems view of professionalism." A behavioral and systems view of professionalism. In contrast to traditional thinking that connects professionalism to, quote, "innate character and virtue," these authors prefer to see professionalism as a set of observable behaviors that are, quote, "shaped by organizational and environmental context." The emphasis is on behaviors rather than attitudes, and attempts to connect values such as, say, integrity and accountability to specific behaviors such as, say, reporting impaired or incompetent colleagues. All good, but as one critic, Jack Houlihan from SUNY Stony Brook, put it, the practice of medicine involves witnessing, not just behaving. The concern is that professionalism charters, quote, "engage the mind, but not the heart." The authors of the JAMA piece concede as much, quote, A growing body of social science literature calls attention to the limits of financial incentives as a motivator and identifies pride of purpose and intrinsic motivation as more powerful forces underlying human behavior. Kind of think about that to let that sink in. The limits to financial incentives and identifies pride of purpose and intrinsic motivation as a more powerful force. Well, yes. This is Deuteronomy 8 or Matthew 4, right? This is man does not live by bread alone. Social science has discovered the reality of the inner life. You can measure it, right? It's a great discovery. But how does one engage it? Let's now turn to the hypothesis of this session, that medicine is a profession, but is more than that. It's a vocation, a calling, if you wish. You have to resurrect the language of the 19th century to speak of medicine in that way. Here's Emerson, quote, "We love characters in proportion as they are impulsive and spontaneous. The less a man thinks or knows about his virtues, the better we like him." Isn't that true? Don't people like doctors that are really people that they can talk to relate to, not always worrying about which category of desired behavior their actions are falling under? Let me continue to cite Emerson here. The writing is beautiful. Each man, and excuse me, but this is the 19th century, so I'm not going to degenderize Emerson's beautiful prose. But he means people, that's what he means, man and woman. Each man has his own vocation. The talent is the call. There is one direction in which all space is open to him. This is what you want from your doctor, I think. The doctor's there with you because that is the only place she can be. She is called to be there. This is what we mean by medicine as vocation. Let me go on with Emerson. The common experience is that the man fits himself as well as he can to the customary details of that work or trade he falls into and tends it as a dog turns a spit. I love that image. I just love it. Doesn't it feel that way? You're in your job, but you're like a dog just turning the wheel there. Then, Emerson writes, he's a part of the machine he moves. You're just a part of the machine. The man is lost. Until he can communicate to others in his full stature and proportion, he does not yet find his vocation. So to be there, and it's for medicine to be a vocation, or nursing, or whatever field you're in, you have to be there with your full sense of who you are as a person. He must find in that, Emerson writes, an outlet for his character, so he can justify his work to their eyes. If the labor is mean, let him by his thinking and character make it liberal. So yes, Farr Curlin, Emerson would say that you were called back from Guatemala to be a physician. That's what Emerson would say. And as you so movingly observed yesterday, much that we do in medicine is of questionable value. Not clear, if we're honest about it, that we are always serving the public good. That is why you have organized this wonderful conference. That is why we're here today. If the labor is mean, by our own thinking and character, let's make it liberal. That's the point. But what about the spiritual aspect? The argument here today is not just that medicine is a vocation. We're calling it a spiritual vocation. Isn't there some risk to that? Florence Nightingale. On February 7th, 1837, God called me to his service. Again, this is the 19th century. People feel very comfortable talking that way. I'm taking this all from Elliot Friedson's Profession of Medicine. But what does Florence Nightingale do to nursing? She professionalizes it. She despiritualizes it. Okay? There have been complaints about nursing monastic orders, that they were too focused on spiritual prayer, confession, than on treatments with therapeutic intent. The monastic nurses were not really focusing on basically the true spirituality of nursing. Okay? It's not about, if you're a nurse, it's not about praying. It's about giving the treatments in the right way. Nightingale required of nurses character, ability, and training. Yes, you don't go to a doctor for prayer or because she's nice. That's not what we ought to mean by medicine as a spiritual vocation. What you want for your doctors and nurses is for them to be highly professional and to deeply and truly care about you. That's what you want. Why should you have to choose between the two? Jordan Cohn, former president of the Association of American Medical Colleges, here's what he writes. Professionalism presupposes a poorly understood internal state, a, quote, way of being, unquote, marked by, quote, deep-seated empathy for the human condition, unquote, which he terms humanism. Quote, humanism denotes an intrinsic set of deep-seated obligations toward others. Viewed in this way, humanism is seen as the passion that animates professionalism. So there's the answer according to Jordan Cohn. Where do we find the motivation to be professional? It's humanism. Perhaps that's what we want, medicine as a humanistic vocation. The problem is that once you start talking about intrinsic, deep-seated obligations toward others, you have to ask yourself, where do those obligations come from? The obvious issue is the source of a person's humanism and what might sustain it under trying conditions. Is this really spirituality that Cohn is talking about, dressed up in secular garb? Can we be good without God? That's the book that the brilliant physician Robert Buckman, head of the Canadian Humanist Society, wrote and sent to me, knowing my interests. My answer is, obviously, yes. Certainly we can be good without God, and obviously one can be rotten with God. That's nothing new. But the point is that your commitments as a doctor matter. One needs as a physician a sense of what is at stake, a sense of significant being. This is what Heschel said to the AMA in 1964, and Daniel Kim alluded to that yesterday. Reflecting on the source of one's commitments is, in fact, a spiritual task. Let's return now to the real world of patient care. Here's a series of patients that I saw on Monday. A 50-year-old with ovarian cancer with progressive disease through multiple lines of chemotherapy, hospitalized with bowel obstruction. I'd inherited her from another physician who retired. He really never told her that, like, after the 8th chemotherapy treatment, there weren't a whole lot more things that we could do. And it's just now beginning to occur to her that she's got a serious problem. A 60-year-old with breast cancer, metastatic to liver, again, despite multiple lines of chemotherapy, now with intractable nausea. I went into her room. Oh, Dr. Astro, she said. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh, Dr. Astro. To the nurse practitioner I work with, she added, my maker, I know he wants me on this earth for many more years. I hope her maker knows what to do about her growing liver metastases and her weeping breast mass, because I certainly don't. An 80-year-old with lymphoma of the leg, now on her 4th line of chemotherapy, cancer's continuing to grow. All these patients are hoping for answers, hoping that I might be able to fix their problem. Save me, Dr. Astro, is the unspoken wish that I sense. But my toolbox at this point for these patients is pretty close to empty. What can I do? For each one of these patients, for those few minutes of encounter, however I might be feeling, often I confess irritation. I need to be fully present, fully with them. One senior colleague told me that he thought that we physicians had to learn, had to learn to be actors, to act like we cared, even when we didn't. I'm not sure I believe him. I think patients see through that. Jordan Cohn is correct. Deep-seated empathy is what is called for. But where does one find it? Here's what one wise physician, Dr. Eric Cassell, has written. Quote, seasoned doctors and others who care for the dying can only say what experience will teach. The more completely open and unconcerned with self-protection the physician is, the less the emotional price of caring for the suffering, and the greater the reward. Much truth there. A kind heart is its own reward. But let's be honest, Dr. Cassell. Given the choice, wouldn't you rather be lying on a beach somewhere or sipping wine at a cafe than find yourself face to face with so much suffering? Far Curlin, aren't there moments when you wish you were back in Guatemala? Not long ago, I underwent major surgery. As I was waiting in the OR holding area, a Catholic sister stopped by and asked if I would like her to say a prayer. I never had general anesthesia before, and I was quite frightened. I said, by all means. She prayed that God be present in the operating room to guide the hands of my surgeon. It was a comforting thought, and the surgery went well. Perhaps God was present. Who can know? If medicine as a spiritual vocation means anything, it has to be this. Spirituality is not a substitute for good therapeutic medical care. It is a sense of transcendent presence, a sense of transcendent presence that gives meaning to what we do. It establishes as a goal a sense of partnership between physician and patient and a shared spirit of humility. Equally important is the sense of demand. We treat our patients in a spirit of respect and dignity, not only because it is good and right that we do so, but under a transcendental sense of obligation, an obligation that is above and beyond us. As Martin Buber, no religious fundamentalist he, put it, God's address to us penetrates the events in all our lives and turns it into instruction, into demands for you and me. Viktor Frankl wrote about man's search for meaning, but Frankl, I think, had it wrong. Man doesn't need to search for meaning. Meaning is always there. Meaning is searching for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Our next speaker is Sheikh Samir Al-Nas. Sheikh Samir was born in Damascus, Syria, where he studied at the College of Medicine of the University of Damascus. He went on to study in the United States, where he qualified in internal medicine. He has studied with a number of renowned traditional Islamic scholars, or ulama, from Syria and the Arabian Peninsula, including the previous mufti of Syria. He has traditional Islamic licenses in teaching Quranic recitation, Islamic law, theology, and prophetic traditions. And he's presently a professor at the University of Damascus and has for the last dozen years or so been lecturing widely around England and North America. Please join me in welcoming Sheikh Samir Al-Nas.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think my talk is not going to be as practical as the previous talk, because I came from different background, But you may share with me some of these ideas that may be considered as theology, and try to apply it to your life, and see how does it work for you. Because we have some bright ideas that perhaps in all of our life, out of our experience, always we should try something else or try to get out of our routine life, and try to think in different way or have it in an opposite way, let's say, and see if it works, and it may work for you in many occasions. Again, we are stuck with this critical question: is medicine a spiritual vocation? And the answer to this highly important and vital question may sound strange, because I may agree with our friend that it is no and yes at the meanwhile. Yes, it is no and it is yes. What do I mean no? It is no because medicine, one of the major experimental sciences, depends completely on what is physical or seen. And it's a materialistic science, and it's built only on experiments, and that's why you don't expect to have medicine as a spiritual vocation. But on the other hand, we are not dealing with stocks or money or this or that. We deal with human being, which may make it little bit, because perhaps human is the most complicated creation on the earth, and this make it little bit complicated, and that's why here you are not dealing only with the physical matters like infections or disease or you name it. You deal with suffering, you deal with pain, you deal with thought, you deal with psychology, you deal with many other aspects that influence all of our lives, regardless if we like it or not. That's why, on the other hand, it is yes, because a human has two components in our thoughts: the body, the physical or seen, and by this you deal with the physical matters, the experimental one, and on the other hand, you have the soul, the non-physical or the unseen, or it may be termed in different culture or different education, by different terms, but no doubt all of us, we share these two components, and you feel it in all over your life, Sometimes you may have unexplained depression, you may have unexplained pain, you may have anything of those regard, and this has been well organized, even well recognized, even in the medicine as a practice. So, on answering it by two aspects, of yes and no, I think human should govern himself in a very well balanced way between the two components, without being extreme or deviated. Namely, we find in our life, many who are just confined themselves, to the materialism of it, and just deal by it, and from that aspect, without giving the human his right, to express his own feeling, or what does he feel, what he practice, what he suffer, and you name it, On the other hand, you may have the other deviation, which goes only by the spiritual matters, without taking good care, of the needs of the body and the health care, and you name it, of that problem. And I think the best answer is going to have the well-balanced way between these two components, and try to find your way in this busy life, nowadays, in between. The body needs should be adjusted according to the physical rules in general and medical rules in particular, no doubt about it. All of us, we should eat, we should drink, we should sleep, and we should have all those physical activities, which is part of our needs, but part of our daily routine matters, to be done, And whenever we try to bypass them, we are going to be deviated, we are going to suffer a lot, and we are going to be in no good outlook. On the other hand, his soul needs should be adjusted according to his belief or religion. And that's why, since yesterday, we have hearing a lot, about science and religion. Do they come together, or they conflict each other, or whatever, And I don't see it in this way, because they deal with different factors, in this life, and each one, it should be recognized and has its own field, And whenever we use something not in its place, we are abusing it, in this regard. So what is religion in my view? For sure, religion per se has been abused by many of us. The politician, when he wants to have more voting, he's going to go to the church, he may do this or that, even though he may not believe in this, I feel it as malpractice of our religion. The physician may do as such, Even the religious man, I'm sorry to say so, even the religious man sometimes, in his practice, he may abuse the meaning, the need of religion, you know. And by this, he's going to astray many people, you know, as if it sounds, all of these people, you know, they try to get the maximum benefit of religion according to their standard, which may not be the case, you know. And all of us, when we go the way it should be handled, you know, in this matter, for sure we are going to have, in my opinion, happier life here when we have this unique relation with the God subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I define it, you may correct me if I'm wrong, it is a relation between two sides, religion. And the first side is the God, which we know that the dominant, knowledgeable, powerful, the most, the best, the eternal, and you name it, many of those descriptions. And the other is the servant, completely with the opposites, you know. And we find our deficiency, even though we may feel that we are good, we are excellent about certain matters, you know, but in many times we are going to find ourselves completely wrong in the same matter that we look at those matters, you know. And that's why we have all these differences, you know, among ourselves. So, in my opinion, the relation should be administered according to the rules of the God. Whenever you want to be religious, you should adjust yourself according to the rules of the God. When I travel to US, I should adjust myself to the rules of this country law, because here is the dominant law that you have here, and I should go according to it. In religion, per se, again, I should adjust myself to the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by this, we are going to find the importance of messengers, you know, all over the years, you know. And that's why there is essential matters, basic matters, you know, about religion that no one has the right to change, you know. And you have the non-basic or non-essential, and this is, you have a significant room of flexibility there. You may show your effort, you may show your thoughts or whatever, you know. And by these two regulations, you know, you are going to be fine in this life, by having these two components. As you may see from the beginning, we should have it handled in well-balanced way, you know, not to be deviated to this side or that, to the other side. And here, as I heard from some of the lecturers yesterday, what's the point to put it, you know, what is the basic, what's the essential? And this is a very good question, you know, and this needs to be addressed, you know, and be well understood in that regard. As a Muslim, all of those matters has been summarized in the Quran in a very short verse. All Muslims, they should recite it if they pray at least 17 times a day. When we say in Arabic, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, which means that we alone do we worship, and you alone do we worship, and your help alone do we seek. Here, the meaning of worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a Muslim doesn't mean only to pray and pay charity. It's much broader and may be applicable to all aspects of his life, all of his duties, including the physician at his clinic or surgery, and the lawyer, and you name it, you know. All of those activities in this life may be considered as worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this view. And by this, you are going to be again well balanced between two activities. Your duties and what you are entitled to do. And this is the first sentence speak about it. We alone do we worship you. This is my responsibility. This is my duty toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then you have the matter of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala which comes to me, and we seek his help in all of these matters. And this is for us without any exception. Yeah, we should do the best as a physician per se, but in many occasions we may fail, we may have very negative outcome or whatever. So we should put in our mind, we seek the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of these matters, in the same way. And this is not only for the physician, if we speak in particular, about this subject, medicine, it's also applicable for the nurse, the patient, and anyone in the medical team, including the patient himself or herself. As I said, this quotation is applicable to all aspects of our life, and we should always fulfill our duty, seeking the help of the God according to His rules, not to our rules. We should seek the help of Allah. And here in our practice, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala left this as a room for us. We should have our duties according to what in our experiments, what we understand, how we should practice, But when we seek the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, as we apply the medical rules, for our practice, we should in the same way apply the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we seek the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exactly. People, they are, in my view, of three types. One is complete denial. They deny all the non-physical or unseen or spiritual portion, and they are materialistic or atheist or some of those quotations that they use for it, And those people, they don't try to apply the spiritual portion to their life, even though they may get exposed to it in some events, of their life, because all of us, we run through different experiences in this life. The second type, which is perhaps applicable to most of us, to be completely heedless, only remember the God at the event. Here, if we speak about medicine, when we have the disease, we live our own life, we don't remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we don't remember the God. When we remember the God, we remember Him whenever we have something or a disease or that is going to compromise some of our activities or some of our decent life that we live nowadays. The third portion, they are well trained and educated all over their real life, and they have their unique relation with the God subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of their life. And whenever they have this experience, disease or disaster or this or that, they are well trained, they are well educated, they are well familiar with what they are going to practice, or to come through. And by this, they may be different than the second one who share with them. The second type, they share the same belief, but in their practice, they were not as good as the third one. But these three types agree on one fact, that this life is coming to an end. This is no doubt about it. Okay. So here, if this is the end of the story, perhaps some may say the first type, they are the best, But if we have something after it, you may not be that right, if you have the first practice, and you should add on it, I would like to say that it's not only for the hereafter, even for this life. And personally, I believe that the happiest among us, those who have the strongest relation with the God in all of their aspects of this life. So it's not needing the spiritual vocation is not needed only for the cure or for the disease or for the hereafter. I feel that it's needed of all aspects of our life, as has been illustrated in that verse that I mentioned from the Quran. So, after this introduction, what is disease? How we should look at the disease per se? We should look at it as a reminder that all favors and gifts are from Allah, from the God, and not original. Here, as we know, we present in this life, completely weak, ignorant, no money, nothing, and we try to build ourselves. So here, when we have something goes against what we have done all of our life, this is as a reminder to us that all of those matters, they are not original. You are not the one who have all those matters inside yourself. This has been given to you by the help, by the favor of Allah, of the God subhanahu wa ta'ala. Second point is a reminder of the continuous change in the human, which tells about his future. And when I start feel pain in my knee, that means I'm not that young person, who used to jog, or run or do this or that. This is a reminder for me that this is going to come to an end. And these are the signs of having me come to the end. When I refrain having sugar, because I have diabetes, or salt because I have all these changes in our life, they are reminder for us that these changes tells us that we are not going to last forever in this globe. It may be sometimes a matter of protection of much worse event. And this is illustrated by the Prophet ﷺ when he said, the God protect his servant the way you protect your patient. You may have something which is hated for you, or you don't like it, or whatever, but by it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the God subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you of much more worse event that is going to happen. We read in history, I'm sorry to give this example, which doesn't sound that good, We read in the history about the governor of Egypt, who they have a plan against him to assassinate him during his prayer, in the morning. And he got sick that day, and he was not able to go out, and his deputy was killed instead of him. This is very strong example, but many of our events nowadays that we may hate, when we look at this provision from the God on us, and we seek his help, we are going to find exactly as if it's a matter of protecting us of much worse is going to happen to us, rather this in this life or in the hereafter. And the last one, which has been ascertained by the God, that whatever is going to happen to you, you should feel that this is the best. So here, in another way, in theory, if you are given the choice, you are going to do whatever Allah, the God, wants you to do. And in our experience, you may find it in many occasions that you love this to happen to you, and you work hard, to have it, and it did not took place, then you find out after many years that this was the best done for you. And by this unique relation, feeling that you are under the help of Allah, the God, under the supervision of the God, and He may protect you of certain matters that you like a lot, as we try to protect our patients, in this life, protect them of having nice food or this or that, because just for the sake of their health. And when we understand this relation between us and the God, we are going to have different look, and for sure this is going to be a cheerful look, in that matter. For sure, I think we don't have any exception. All of us, we experience this negative or this hated events in our life forcefully because we don't have any choice. Some of us may do it by a certain type of election. I give an example about it, fasting. Here, when we say fasting, it is a way of worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As if you stop eating, drinking, for sure you are going to have some negative feeling. You may feel thirsty, you may feel hungry. And this is in my opinion, this is a good experience to see how certain matters that you hate or you don't like to do, whenever you do it or you come through it, is going to be helpful for you in your life. Because as you may see in this life, not everything is going to be happy or the way we want. So this way of having certain of these practices, by your full optional way of doing it, without having anyone forcing it on it or dictated on you, it has its own experience. And those people who go through these experiences, the expectation to have them much more ready whenever any of the negative event happen, in this life, to have more acceptance and more education about it, how we should deal with those matters, because they have it in the optional way to start with. But for sure, please don't misunderstand me, because I hear about other practices, those who torture their body or try to punish the body or whatever. This is not meant at all. What it means that you should have some type of training, some type of having something available, and you don't practice it just to be ready whenever this might happen, and for sure it's going to happen to all of us in many occasions, So by this, you are going to be ready, by this experience. That's why this has been expressed that fasting is half of the patience. And this, as if you train your patience that you are in need of it, not only for, in my opinion, not only for the negative or unhappy events in your life. No, it's for all matters of your life, Even the happy event, you should have some control about it. You shouldn't go beyond the rack, and you should have some breaks there, And by this, being patient, and have this experience of patience, is going to help you a lot. So, in summary, the advantages of medicine as a spiritual experience, in my opinion, will get stronger, no doubt about it, okay? Because here, physically, you are completely sometimes paralyzed, but you are spiritually going to be stronger. And the second point, you are going to have much more confidence in what's going on, because you have experienced all of your life and you seek the help of Allah, of the God, and you are going to be pleased or accept what happened to you. And this is one of the major matters which we deal with it in our life. Some of us, even though he may be healthy or wealthy or you name it, he is not happy, he is not pleased. Why? Because he see the others, or compare himself to the others, And by this way of understanding, even though whenever you are exposed to those negative events in your life, you are going to be pleased with the God in that regard. And in many times, I'm not telling you always, sometimes or many times, it may be curable also. And all of us, we heard about those experiences, about a person who was cured, which is not fully understood according to the medical measurements and standards we have nowadays. The best example in my mind, and I have it in my experience, the stroke people, In my experience, those people, whenever you see someone who is determined that is going to be cured or whatever, I see a significant improvement in those people. On the other hand, those who feel depressed, and be completely handicapped, significant percentage of them, they are going to pass away in very short period of that. That is in my experience. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. This may not be applicable to all diseases. For sure, we have infection, we have other matters, But in some of those, it may be curable, and that's why I put it in at last. On the other hand, the disadvantages of feeling that the medicine as a spiritual vocation, first of all, to compromise your duties. Okay? And here, when someone relies completely on spirits or whatever, he may and I don't know, here perhaps you are very good, about the practice, but elsewhere you may have some people, who tend to compromise their duty, bearing in mind that when we seek the help of Allah, that's it, and no need for any other thing. So I see this as a disadvantage, of the medicine, to look at the medicine as a spiritual vocation. The other one, some of us may have hallucination, illusion, or delusion of those matters, or in another word, you may have certain feelings which is not applicable. And that's why we related it to religion, just to make it all governed according to the God, how He instructed it to us. Lastly, some of those people, they may speak about the unseen, about the non-physical matters in a way which doesn't fit according to the standards of the God. How to make it work for us? Firstly, we should broaden it. It's not limited to medicine or anything. As I said in the introduction, to broaden it to all aspects of our life. And secondly, to have the continuity of it, because just to start it whenever I get sick or have disease or have this problem, it may not work for me, because I'm not the one who is trained and well experienced in it. And thirdly, by have full confidence in whatever you believe. You should have full confidence in that, and by this is going to at least make you psychologically more cheerful and face those problems, in a very good way. And also it's going to increase your hope for the future and have good thought. Why? Because you know the God much more than the others, and you look back at your previous life, and see how the God was helpful for you, because you have been feeding this in all aspects of your life. And then this is going to improve your relation with everyone else. Here, when you have all relation with the other governed by your relation with the God, your relation with your parent is going to be perfect, with children, with anyone in general, because humans, they are deficient in general, and when they have the benefit, whenever I get benefit of my father, I'm going to be good to him, and whenever otherwise, I'm going to interrupt this relation. This doesn't sound good, Whereas when you have it through the God, all of these relations, they are going to improve as such. So lastly, how to strengthen it? As it's mentioned by the Prophet, to observe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, try to observe Allah, try to observe the God in all of your aspect of this life. Sorry, so I will stop here, inshallah. Thank you for listening.
Our next speaker, before we take a break, is my friend and colleague, Dan Sulmacy. Dan is a New Yorker and went to Cornell for undergrad and medical school, after which he went to Hopkins and completed a residency in internal medicine, was a chief resident on the Osler service there, and also did a post-doctoral fellowship. Dan went on to study philosophy and completed his PhD at Georgetown University, working quite a bit with Dr. Edmund Pellegrino, whose work many of you know. And Dan has been, as many of you know, has been one of the real strong contributors to the field of spirituality and health, religion and medicine, in his writing and in his speaking. In particular, he has 3 books. The first was The Healer's Calling, which came out in 1997. Then the second, The Rebirth of the Clinic, and the third, A Balm for Gilead. I know Dan's working on another book in this area on the spiritual dimensions of the practice of medicine and patients' experiences of illness. At the University of Chicago, he co-directs the program of medicine and religion. He's also the associate director of the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics, and holds a chair, the Kilbride Clinton Chair in Medicine and Ethics, and a position between both the medical school and the divinity school. So with that introduction, please join me in welcoming Dan.
Thanks a lot, Far, for that very generous introduction. Thanks to everyone for being here. In 1897, William Osler gave an address at the New York Academy of Medicine that was entitled Internal Medicine as a Vocation. The text of the address has been widely anthologized, but like a lot of Osler's writings, it's really rarely read. And if you do read it, what appears most curious for the contemporary reader is the fact that in this essay, Osler makes absolutely no attempt to say what a vocation is or to explain why medicine should be one. Rather, he just seems to assume that everybody will understand and get on with the rest of the talk. Now, the focus of my talk is going to be on the idea of medicine as a vocation. I want to explore a little bit what I think it's meant historically, whether it might have any meaning today. I'll speak a little bit about Osler, but mostly for illustrative purposes. This is not posthumous psychospiritual analysis of the great W.O. But in taking Osler as a starting point, I think we have to recognize how little people in medicine, while he's well adored, know about his life. Notably, Osler was the son of a minister. As a youth, he was seriously considering becoming a minister himself. Interestingly, it was an Anglican divine who became his first great teacher of science, and in a sense helped Osler to discover what he himself later took to be his true vocation. And Osler's great textbook, The Principles and Practice of Medicine, which was written many years later, is dedicated first and foremost to that man, the Reverend William Arthur Johnson. Now, just how Christian Osler continued to be in his later life is a matter of debate. This much can probably be said securely about his inner life. The first, he was a pragmatist. Second, he understood the power of science and he thought scientifically. But third, I think that he never lost a deep and abiding sense of Christian virtue. And I think these three strands of thought converge to shape his idea of medicine as a vocation. In a way, if you will, his way of pragmatizing what had been an essentially Christian notion. He was very explicit and emphatic about the idea of medicine as a vocation, writing, for instance, quote, "The practice of medicine is an art, not a trade, a calling, not a business, a calling in which your heart will be exercised equally with your head," unquote. Now, as original a thinker as Osler was, he was also a man of his times, and other people had similar thoughts. So, for instance, in 1908, Stephen Paget wrote this book called Confessio Medici, in which he writes, quote, "For if a doctor's life may not be a divine vocation, then no life is a vocation, and nothing is divine," unquote. Similar sentiments get expressed by Harvey Cushing, famous for his Consecratio Medici, and also as late as 1948, Lord Horder could write an article in The Lancet that was entitled Medicine as a Vocation. Imagine trying to get that published in The Lancet today, right? Why were prominent physicians at the end of the 19th century and into the first half of the 20th century so ready to describe medicine as a vocation? Now, in the days of the shaman, of course, the roles of the physician and religious healer were intertwined. Healing was, as Professor Ferngren suggested to us from the beginning, a religious act. And as he also explained to us in the Christian West, healing was central to the ministry of Jesus, and visiting the sick became a major duty of Christian charity, and the monk herbalist of the medieval monastery was the physician of his day. And in fact, it's from the monastic virtue of offering hospitality to the sick that we derive our contemporary word hospital. Now, the world of the late 19th century, however, was very different from the 14th century monastery. And in his fascinating book that I hope we're going to hear more about after the break, Trusting Doctors, Jonathan Imber tells a fascinating story of an alliance that he feels developed between medicine and the clergy during the late 19th and early 20th century. From about the 1850s to the 1890s, he points out, most medical school graduation addresses were in fact given by clergy. something that's not widely known. At least it wasn't until I read the book something that I even thought of. As Imber describes it, the clergy effectively were deputizing the graduates as religious and moral figures, ceding to physicians the kind of moral authority they sensed they themselves were losing in society. Medicine became, as Osler, Paget, Cushing, Lord Horder, and others testify, a secular, if not always a religious, vocation. By the middle of the 20th century, though, things began to change. The idea of vocation itself had become so secularized that it had come to mean something more akin to self-fulfillment. Medicine in the mid-20th century was also gaining even greater technological power, a boon to the welfare of the sick that also augmented the prestige of physicians, a prestige they previously had earned through their efforts at internal reform and professionalization. And gradually the idea of vocation became less prominent and was supplanted by the idea of medicine as a career. Those physicians old enough to remember now look back at this time as medicine's golden age. Medicine was fascinating and always changing. Physicians enjoyed great respect. The science was challenging and interesting, and yet the body of knowledge was still manageable enough that the average internist could really grasp it all. Medicine was making life better for everyone, and physicians enjoyed enormous social respect and authority. But like many states of affairs, Imber contends that this historical situation contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. He argues that all this power and prestige proved toxic. It went to our heads. We abused the technology, we abused the prestige, we betrayed the trust. We became more interested in our careers than in our patients, more in the science than in our art. We enjoyed great financial success, and sadly sometimes at the expense of our patients and society as a whole. Now, other people quickly realized they could get in on the action and prove more able than physicians to turn the care of the sick into a wealth-generating enterprise. The notion of medicine as a profession, let alone a vocation, was soon challenged on every side. The consumer movement widened its scope from toasters to physicians. Patients became deeply suspicious they were being overtreated merely for profit. Medical inflation began to spin out of control, and corporate America introduced managed care to attempt to control those costs. And physicians were effectively, if you will, quote, proletarianized, unquote, turned into physicians or treated as private contractors who could be manipulated through a system of financial incentives. Economists, lawyers, and government officials denounced the monopoly powers of the profession and considered the very idea of professionalism to be a thinly veiled excuse for a collective collusion to fix and raise prices. By the end of the 20th century, medicine had become, in the eyes of many, just another job. Yet the idea of medicine as a vocation is not as dead as it might first appear. Farr-Curlin and his colleagues in a national survey of physicians found, for instance, that 72% of American physicians agree strongly or agree with the quote, "For me, the practice of medicine is a calling," unquote. And while we can't be certain of what they mean by endorsing that statement, I think it's clear that the idea of medicine as a vocation has not become altogether anachronistic. So it probably is important that we become a little bit clearer about the meaning of the word vocation. A vocation is more than an occupation or an avocation. A vocation is a calling. Etymologically, it's derived from the Latin verb vocare, to call. A vocation is a calling, not a calling from, but a calling to a special kind of task. And the idea of a vocation has at least these two essential elements: a call and a special role or task. Now, the idea of a calling perhaps represents the chief stumbling block for many persons today to accepting the idea that medicine could be called a vocation. The idea of a call implies a caller, And this means properly an acceptance of the idea of the transcendent. To say that one has a vocation implies then some sort of faith, a faith that there is something beyond oneself. Certainly the word vocation has a long history of religious use in which the caller is understood to be God, and the special task associated with the call, either the work of ministry or the consecrated life. But the notion of vocation may be less of a problem for physicians than we might be inclined to think initially. In Farr's survey, for instance, only 10% report that they have no religious beliefs at all, and this suggests that many U.S. physicians still have some explicitly religious values, ideas, or language which they could take up the idea of medicine as a vocation in this very traditional religious sense. Any physician who is not religious, however, can still conceive, I believe, of medicine as a vocation in the sense that it is a response to something else that transcends him or her. Charles Taylor has described at least an immanent sense of transcendence, a notion he argues is still pervasive in our secular world, a sense of transcendence that's conceived within the bounds of space and time, which nonetheless, though, is far beyond the ken of any individual. As such, I would suggest that all physicians, both those who are religious and those who are not, must acknowledge the possibility that they could be called to the practice of medicine by something beyond themselves, even if that beyond is simply this: the prolonged and deep wail of the collective physical suffering of all humanity. You see, the need that medicine proposes to address, the need for healing, is in an absolute and total sense transcendent, beyond the possible reach of any and all individual clinicians. All patients are mortal. Absolute healing is beyond the reach of any of us. And if one can acknowledge the inherent need of all humanity for complete healing as the possible source of a call, then one could still be said to have a call that is transcendent. The idea of a call remains problematic for contemporary Western culture, however, not only because this necessarily transcendent element is there, but for the very idea that the origin of a vocation is outside of oneself. Think even to the language of Emerson about this. We live in the era of the Great Gatsby, the era of self-expression and self-creation. A vocation claims to originate from without, not from within. A vocation is a response, not a self-originated thought. The task is to decide if one is suitable. Thus, the call must touch the caller in some significant way. One who has a vocation must sense not just the call, which is universal, but a correspondence between that call and one's person, and one's fitness to the task at hand. A call must be recognized as corresponding then to one's authentic self. While the call to vocation is general, the caller is seeking persons who are genuinely suited to the special task. In the Hebrew Scriptures, for instance, the Lord asks, "Who shall I send?" And Isaiah the prophet must explicitly respond, "Send me." The dynamic is the same for anyone who hears any kind of vocational call. A vocation also typically demands of the one who is called a number of important virtues. Typical of anything that could be properly called a vocation include a sense of commitment. A commitment is ordinarily expected to last a lifetime, even when the going gets tough. A vocation also typically involves a substantive and permanent change in one's identity. For instance, a retired rabbi does not cease to be a rabbi. A retired physician does not cease to be a physician. As Harvey Cushing notes, more than just a commitment, a vocation requires a devotion, a positive affective connection and orientation towards the task and towards those to whom the special work is directed. Vocations also typically require an altruistic spirit, a willingness to make sacrifices and to put at least some of one's own interests aside in order to do the task. And further, those who are called to vocations are expected to meet higher moral standards than those of the general public. This doesn't mean that anyone who has a vocation is automatically made perfect, but that they're called to a higher standard of virtue and morals. For instance, bribery is wrong, but a bribe taken by a priest or a physician is typically to be judged worse. Finally, vocations typically entail entrance into a community of other persons who share that vocation, working with them in concert to advance that special task. Cushing's devotion, therefore, is a common devotion. And what is promised in return is a deep sense of meaning and purpose. If the call has corresponded to one's true identity, then one finds an abiding happiness in one's vocation. Now, how is this accomplished? In many ways, the vocation is actualized for physicians through the taking of an oath. One professes one's vocation. Consecrated religious, such as monks, friars, and nuns, profess their vows, and physicians receive a degree when they finish their coursework, but become members of the profession upon professing the oath. While medical oaths now assume a variety of forms, they all have certain elements in common. They all invoke some sort of sense of a transcendent witness, swearing, for instance, by, quote, all that I hold sacred, unquote. They involve becoming part of a community. They prescribe a higher moral standard. They include some kind of a pledge of altruism. Anyone who swears a medical oath has made a public commitment to be a different kind of person, professing the essential elements of a proper response to a vocational call. Now, this brings us to the second aspect of a vocation. Is the task of medicine sufficiently special to be called a vocation? If the notion of call can be understood satisfactorily in the 21st century, we must be able to defend the claim that it involves a special task. Is medicine anything like the clerical state or the consecrated religious life that were traditionally associated with words like vocation? Now, I take the goal of medicine to be this: to help human beings to flourish as the kinds of things that they are, in and through a ministry to the biological aspects of the human. The biological may not be sufficient for our flourishing, but it's certainly important. If one dies of infantile diarrhea, one will never dance with a daughter at her wedding. If one has a stroke, one may be able never to paint a masterpiece. And so it is that if I visit the accountant, I can say that my taxes are the issue. No, if I visit the auto mechanic, I can say that my carburetor is the issue. But if, in a very real sense, when I visit the doctor, I am the issue. Medicine's subject is fundamentally a common good, what we most have in common, our biological nature and its finitude. None of us, as physicians, can claim to own medicine. Even a Nobel laureate in medicine has only created an infinitesimally small fraction of the knowledge that we can put to the service of the sick. We don't ask those patients who volunteer for our students to practice physical diagnosis, or those who volunteer as subjects in our research projects, or those who donate their bodies for anatomical instruction, please, would you give us access to your body at no cost so we can learn from you and in turn sell back what we have learned to your grandchildren at the highest price the market will bear? No, we ask them to contribute instead to the common good to which we ourselves are pledged, the healing of the sick. The goal of medicine, it's telos in the Greek, is to help our fellow human beings to flourish through the restoration or preservation or amelioration of their biological dysfunction. That goal, I think, is so fundamental that it merits being considered something special among the tasks any human being could set for himself or herself. And thus, I think the task of medicine is worthy of being called a vocation. Further, society has a critical interest in involving a cadre of physicians who consider themselves called to this work. As argued above, the basic idea of a vocation carries with it the idea of being called to service to a common good. Given a choice between two equally technically competent physicians, one who considers the work a job and the other a calling, which would you choose? The sociologists Robert Bella and William Sullivan have written, in fact, that the notion of a vocation is, quote, the essential element that keeps the idea of profession from generating into a purely private career, unquote. The idea of medicine as a vocation also entails the idea that medicine is an act of faith in something greater than oneself, in something that is, at least in that sense, transcendent. And this transcendence is at the heart, in the end, of what medicine does. Because the need that medicine addresses, the need for absolute healing, is incalculably large and impossible for any of us to provide. Medicine is a finite craft addressing an infinite need. Medicine is also at once a universal science, artfully practiced by and for individuals. Medicine is an objective enterprise, and yet it is directed towards the service of the subjective experiences of illness and injury. So medicine is thus intrinsically paradoxical. The practice is finite but infinite, universal yet particular, objective yet subjective. Plunging oneself headfirst into the mysteries of these paradoxes, a physician must, in an act of faith, be part and parcel of service to the mystery of the human. Thus, I think we do have a common devotion, a common commitment to live lives that are worthy of the oaths that we have sworn. And by the oaths that we have professed, we have declared ourselves willing to respond to this common calling. We may hear that vocational call through a diversity of voices, but I think we do have one common calling. Now, I've tried to argue that this sense of vocation is at the heart of what it means as a practice at any time in history, in any place, and in any culture. It would be naive of me, and Alan Astros sort of set me up for this, to suggest this sort of understanding will be easy to cultivate today. One obstacle, I think, is nihilism, the lack of faith in anything that's so prevalent in our world today. A second obstacle is the sorry state of moral education in our culture. Many students, while interested in ethics, come to medical school today with little in the way of serious moral formation of any sort. Third, there is an intense public distrust of physicians today. This makes claims of vocational aspiration difficult to sustain. Fourth, the economic transformation of U.S. healthcare grates harshly against this vocational paving stones of medicine that I've laid. Fifth, our political system has reached the point of paralysis with respect to medicine. One observer has put it this way: everybody wants everything, no one wants to pay for anything, and no one is willing to say no to anyone. That's a formula for chaos, and we are living in that chaos. And sixth, medicine may well be the last bastion of logical positivism, given up by the physicists long ago, this view that nothing exists that can't be empirically verified. But Osler warned us about this long ago when he wrote, "Science is organized knowledge, and knowledge, the Sheikh will appreciate this, is of things we see. Now, of the things that are temporal, of things that are unseen, science knows nothing, and at this present moment has no means of knowing anything." One cannot see a vocation. If one requires empirical verification, an evidence-based reason for accepting that medicine is a vocation, then medicine will never be a vocation. And yet perhaps the length of the litany of challenges I provided gives us evidence that we've hit bottom as a society and a profession. One sign that this might be the case is the fact that patients and practitioners are increasingly interested in spirituality and medicine, longing again for a form of medicine which is informed by a sense of transcendence deep enough to sound a resounding call. Having suppressed the idea of medicine as a vocation, we have noticed a void in the experiences of our patients and in our own experiences as healers. We sense intuitively what the practice of medicine calls us to be. So, I return to my question. Is Osler still right? Is medicine a vocation today? In a very fundamental sense, I want to say that the answer is yes. In another sense, I think the view is being challenged in historically unprecedented ways that make it harder than it has ever been for any of us to see that truth. And yet I'm heartened by those surveys in which physicians say they still see medicine as a calling. I'm heartened by those students who come to medical school searching for the moral and spiritual meaning of the craft. I think they know instinctively that Osler is still right. His own words resonate for them when he says, "You are in this profession as a calling, not as a business. A calling which exacts from you at every turn self-sacrifice, devotion, love, and tenderness. Once you get down to the purely business level, your influence is gone and the true light of your life is dimmed. You must work in the missionary spirit with a breath of charity that raises you far above the petty jealousies of life." Can we recover this vocational sense? I think we need to start by reclaiming the meaning that is rightfully ours as practitioners of this noble art. We need to rediscover, to reconnect, and to deepen our own spiritual lives in the broadest sense of what that can mean. We need to reconnect with our fellow practitioners in deeper ways, to rediscover again that we are part of a community of healers, sharing a common devotion. If there are any pre-med students, I'm now going to give away a secret, or medical students actually, that when I interview internship candidates, I always ask one special question. I tell them it's a question I'm sure they were asked repeatedly when they applied to medical school, but have almost certainly never been asked again since matriculation. It's a question that I believe all of us need to ask ourselves repeatedly at all stages of our careers. Why do you want to be a doctor? Do you remember what you said on your own medical school interview? Do you still believe it? Is it different? And if it is different, is it because you're wiser and more experienced, or because you've lost sight of your original call? Were you called to this life? Is anyone or anything still calling you now? The more we ask those questions, the more I believe we will rediscover what we already know, that medicine is a vocation.
We're going to have one more speaker before we have the panel discussion. And Dan, in his talk, was kind enough to give part of the introduction by mentioning the work of Jonathan Imber and his book, Trusting Doctors. Professor Imber is too modest to ask us to put this up, but I just thought it was fitting to leave it up on the screen. If you don't have this book on your shelf, I encourage you to get it. Professor Imber is the Jean Glasscock Professor of Sociology at Wellesley College, where he has taught for the past 30 years. He received his BA from Brandeis and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where he worked under the very renowned sociologist of medicine, Renee Fox, and with the very renowned Philip Reif. Specific to this conference is Professor Imber's work looking at the medical profession, and in particular, this book, Trusting Doctors, The Decline of Moral Authority in American Medicine, published by Princeton University Press. So without further ado in that regard, I'm going to welcome Professor Imber to speak today, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. I should start with at least one disclaimer. I am not a physician. I don't play one on TV, and I don't play one in the classroom. In fact, my graduate mentor, Philip Reif, used to say he was neither our theologian or our therapist. And I think that I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to write about a profession that people ask me, why didn't you want to be a physician? And why do you want to be a physician? And the answer to that question was that it was a different time when the choice was available. And in fact, I kind of think that my not having done that and having done what I've done instead was better for medicine. And that's largely because my generation, the baby boom generation, had a hand in changing the character of the profession. And I didn't like it at the time, and so I've been writing about it ever since. I believe that I am correct in observing that a conference such as has been organized for these few days would have been largely unimaginable a quarter century ago, much less a half century ago. And that's despite what we've heard. A half century ago in 1962, the age of the general practitioner was coming to an end, superseded by the age of specialization. Doctors' responsibilities were largely cast in the vernacular of civil rights, with the rights of patients emerging in second-wave feminism in particular. So it is that when I began my own studies with a special interest in religion, about the last association I can really imagine was one between religion and medicine. All that began to change for me when in 1986, a book that was mentioned yesterday by Professor Marty, edited by Ronald Numbers and Darrell Amundsen, entitled Caring and Curing, Health and Medicine in the Western Religious Traditions, appeared. Of course, historians of medicine have been careful to document the close associations between religion and medicine, however each was defined throughout the ages. But as John Burnham outlined in his summary essay in the journal Science in 1982, entitled American Medicine's Golden Age, What Happened to It? Something like a vast amnesia reigned over both the profession and public culture generally about how the Western religious traditions related and influenced less the technical practice of medicine than the character of the practitioner, my particular interest. Delving into Numbers and Amundsen's edited collection, I noticed several footnotes in a chapter on the Reformed tradition that contained citations to sermons that Protestant ministers had delivered to medical students during the 19th century. That led me on a decade search. It was Alice down the rabbit hole. I got lost in it for a while. It led me on a decade search for sermons, medical school commencement addresses, and other talks that clergymen had given, in which many of them acknowledged the important ways in which doctors ministered to patients in addition to treating them. At that time, it was taken for granted that doctors were to understand themselves always as more than medically competent. They were also to be, that's because in the 19th century they weren't particularly medically competent. They were also to be inspired by the idea of possessing a vocation, an idea that still resonates today, even if we are unclear of its roots and its expressions as they have emerged from different religious traditions to endure in secular culture, including now the highly secular culture of medicine and science. I should like to say a little bit about secularization and as it's reflected in the separation of church and state at the end of my remarks, because I think we are not only at the end of medicine's golden age, as Burnham described it, but on the verge of a new era in which renewal of our various faith traditions has much to offer in understanding the values of medical science and its practice. I've been asked to offer some remarks on the book I wrote, and so I took that to heart. My use of the word decline in the title of the book was nothing personal about individual doctors, but rather about the social status of a profession once highly esteemed and whose practitioners were highly respected. My own discipline, sociology, had a hand to play in the broad criticisms that the medical profession was subject to, beginning in full force in the 1960s. But I want to illustrate today my claim that concern about risks of decline in moral authority began much earlier, roughly 150 years ago. At around the same time, you can easily observe the awakening of an ancient profession to the dual dictates of natural science and bureaucratic organization. That is to say that what we now still describe as modern medicine submitted itself to the dictates of scientifically guided experiments and the many discoveries they yielded, as well as to the formal organization of medical schools and hospitals. It is now considered the case among some historians that at least several decades before the famous Flexner Report, the training of physicians was improving under the guidance of models brought to the United States from Europe and exemplified in the organization of that training, in particular in the creation of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in 1893. There are two flashpoints that I developed in my book that I'd like to consider here that illustrate the conflicts between religion and medicine broadly defined. The first is what in the last quarter of the 19th century became known as the prayer gauge debate, and the other, picking up from Dr. Somasi's remarks on William Osler about his departure from Johns Hopkins in 1905. Let me start with the prayer gauge debate. Prayer as a petition for divine acknowledgement can hardly be described as narrowly sectarian. During the 19th century, the clergy in England had well established special days for prayers and fasting, including specific petitions for rain, for the end of cholera and cattle plague, and for the recovery of good health of the Prince of Wales. But as the century proceeded, British clergymen found themselves in direct conflict with various and new authorities, all of whom professed hostility toward the use of prayer to effect a particular result. In 1853, a request to appoint a fast day to combat cholera was rejected by officials because they believed they understood well enough the causes of the outbreaks to address them effectively. In defending the actions of the government not to sanction the clergy's efforts to define the causes of cholera, Charles Kingsley, a liberal clergyman and advocate of public health measures, rejected the simple-minded attempts to attribute the disease to what he, I quote, Maynooth, the Crystal Palace, the Jerusalem bishopric, the neglect of the church fast, the neglect of the worship of the Virgin, the increase of the worship of the Virgin, free trade, protection, any and every cause but that palpable one of which the poor, unwashed, gas-poisoned hearers were but all too well aware. The steady improvement of knowledge about disease in particular turns such attributions and correlations into careless and irrational forms of explanation. But a deeper impulse was also at work, one which apparently survives no matter how powerful the causal explanations may become. The impulse to make correlations between one phenomenon and another, between one sphere of life and another, is rooted in the process of making things meaningful and of establishing the kinds of explanations which may put certain questions and the anxieties they elicit to rest, if only temporarily. Now, John Tyndall, a well-known polemicist for science, British, Irish actually, but had his influence in Britain, figured in the emerging public controversies over what became known as the efficacy of prayer in such national circumstances. In late 1865, in the Fortnightly Review, he criticized prayers being offered to end the plague. The use of prayer to influence a particular circumstance appears to have been controversial, in part because it revealed a certain lack of knowledge about causality itself. The tension persists today between determining and treating disease at the deepest level of causality, or preventing it long before the need to treat it, and thus understand it more fundamentally, arises. That's public health. Much of the controversy in England was, as the historian Frank Turner has persuasively argued, between established religious authority and fledgling scientific authority. But it was also about the nature of human understanding of the meaning of the events themselves. One legacy of the disputes in England is that debates over the efficacy of prayer presage the ways in which public policy about health is presently debated in what remains enduring social conditions of uncertainty. When Edward, the Prince of Wales, contracted typhoid in 1871, special prayers were offered on his behalf. Within several days, his condition improved. This was taken as evidence by some clergymen of the real efficacy of prayer. By mid-February of 1872, the nation was in a state of euphoria over the prince's recovery. The doctors who had attended were hardly acknowledged for their own role in his treatment, and much of the publicity about the recovery itself focused on the effects of prayer on illness. British medical journals bristled at the affront to the important role that medicine, that doctors, and increasingly public health measures played in the treatment and prevention of the disease. The illness of Prince Edward and the chagrin of the British medical establishment set the stage for what became known as the prayer gauge debate. The ensuing debates touched upon important questions about the nature of causality and probability, concepts that were associated with science and medicine alike. And the newly emerging intellectual attacks on religion put pressure on all figures in authority to justify their authority on the basis of skill and competence. The trustworthiness of physicians was to undergo a transformation that would create a new balance between trust in doctors and more demanding expectations placed upon them about the outcome of medical treatment. The seeds are being sown then. The specific controversy began in the pages of the British periodical, The Contemporary Review, in July of 1872. John Tyndall figured prominently insofar as he introduced the proposal to determine the efficacy of prayer for healing the sick. The proposal itself was unsigned and composed as a letter to Tyndall. It's regarded to have been written by Sir Henry Thompson, a prominent London surgeon who in years subsequent would become involved in debates about cremation. Tyndall noted that the writer seeks to confer quantitative precision on the action of the supernatural in nature. The question for all to consider was whether it was possible to propose some way of measuring such an effect. Thompson examined the many types of supplication, he took them from the Book of Common Prayer, that one might be amenable to testing, and found, I quote, that there appears to be one source from a study of which the absolute calculable value of prayer, I speak with the utmost reverence, can almost certainly be ascertained. I mean its influence in affecting the course of a malady or in averting the fatal termination. Thompson described two types of prayers that were made on behalf of the ill, those offered weekly as general prayers for all who were sick, and those offered specifically for individuals who enjoyed one of the advantages of rank and gentle birth in England. That is, special prayers are made for such every week at least in most churches throughout the country. Special prayers were intended to concentrate many minds on the recovery of one person in particular, and thus imitated more direct therapeutic intervention, while general prayers were made for the population of ill persons at any given moment in time. In this latter respect, general prayers were as much in keeping with strategies of prevention as with intervention. In this way, Thompson was able to argue for a clinical approach toward prayer that was already used by physicians and researchers in their work with medical treatments. Long before debates about the efficacy of alternative or integrative medicine, Thompson called for an epidemiology of prayer by insisting that scientific method could be applied to domains as yet untested by such methods. But he also endeavored to alter common sense about the function of religion generally. The prayer test would follow the same methods for determining the efficacy of medical treatments, using a case control design in which patients with a diagnosed illness would be divided into two groups, one treated by whatever measures had been used before, and the other treated with the proposed remedy, in this instance, prayer. The essence of Thompson's proposal was to ask that special prayers be offered for patients on a single ward or in one hospital, quotes, under the care of the first-rate physicians and surgeons, containing certain numbers of patients afflicted with those diseases which have been best studied and of which the mortality rates are best known. Such prayers would be offered for a period of 3 to 5 years. Quote, at the end of that time, the mortality rates should be compared with the past rates and also with that other leading hospitals similarly well managed during the same period. This prospective study of prayer was simple and elegant in its design, requiring little expense and providing, quote, an occasion of demonstrating to the faithless an imperishable record of the real power of prayer. Thompson's alleged ingenuousness was intended to be disarming, but it elicited pointed responses in Britain's leading periodicals. The earliest reply appeared in The Spectator in the form of an editorial. It took immediate exception to, quote, this elaborate sarcasm, an unworthy piece of literary irony, and it chided Tyndall in particular for associating his name with it. The Spectator's editorial writer approached the problem of measuring prayer by denying its external possibility. The editorial writer wrote, but we should be much surprised to learn that any man who had really given up his mind to thoughts of this kind at all had ever regarded his prayer as a sort of petty dictation to God, the effect of which might be measured, like a constituent's pressure on his representative in Parliament, by the influence it exerted on the issue. And disclosing what he believed to be the true purpose of prayer, the editorial writer concluded, you pray, if you pray in the spirit of Christ at all, not for a specific external end, but because it is a deep relief to pour out your heart to God in the frankest way possible to limited human nature, and in the hope that if your wish is not granted, your want may be. I'd say that the contrast here could not be more striking. On the one hand, prayer was proposed to be put to a test to measure its alleged external influence upon others and the world generally. On the other hand, prayer is envisioned as a deep relief. In other words, as a source for relieving the anxiety that was provoked by a concern for others. In this second formulation, the anxiety of not knowing what might happen next, limited human nature, is the central motivation for any faith at all. What your prayer really consists of is the confession of the blank you fear for yourself, the editorial writer wrote, and still more, perhaps, for others, of your dread of losing the moral help and sympathy so essential to you, of the yearning that this trouble may not come on those whom it threatens. This was not a selfish anxiety, but one which animated the deepest sense of concern about the control of one's life individually and in relation to others. For example, the concern about the health of one's children, spouse, or a close friend. It was all the more important, therefore, to make clear what might be called the authenticity of the prayerful request itself. The editorial continued, how should we think of any who prayed, i.e., who ought to be pouring out the deepest longings of his soul for the restoration of certain persons of health, only to make a delicate experiment on the relation between the spiritual and physical forces of the universe? Does it follow, because in some sense God answers true prayer, he would answer the demand for a scientifically scaled prayer gauge? Instead of being a test proposed directly for the recovery of dearly beloved persons, it was for the scientific determination of our moral command of the fountains of divine mercy. In other words, such prayer was inauthentic and an affront to and test of God. The problem then was not one of research design or even noble scientific intention, but of fundamental confusion about the nature of faith. Let me stop here to point out that the prayer gauge debate enlisted a variety of well-known figures at the time, including Francis Galton, whose approach to defending such a test had as much to do with his interest in the development of statistics as it did his hostility to religious authority. Galton was a counter of sundry phenomena. He counted everything. And one variable that he added to the test was whether patients prayed for their own recovery. I don't have time to describe all the responses to the proposed prayer test, but suffice it to say that initial objections were more bellicose than reasoned. Eventually, entire books were published on the efficacy of prayer. One in particular by cleric John Hewitt Jellett offered carefully thought through objections, reasonable objections to a test that was not in principle, he thought, an assault on religious faith, but rather a crude attempt to discredit that faith more generally. Sir Henry Thompson's proposed experiment to measure the effects of prayer on the sick, Jellett presumed, had never been actually tried. Supposing that it had been tried, Jellett asked, and he wrote, no difference between the respective percentages of recovery could be detected. What does the principle of the method of differences require us to infer from this? The general inefficacy of prayer? Certainly not, but the inefficacy of prayer under the conditions of the experiment. Jellett's enthusiasm for reasonableness was indicative of the rapidly changing mood among the religiously faithful who sought better accommodation with the shifting balance between the authority of revelation and the powers of observation. This balance favored the powers of observation, leading Jellett to conclude, the statistical argument is theoretically applicable to every case in which the relation of cause and effect or of condition and result is supposed to exist between two phenomena which are more or less completely within the range of human knowledge. That everything could be theoretically correlated with everything else, but for the human and material resources required to carry out such an endeavor, was a compelling way to announce the seemingly endless project of science, whether natural or social. In my field, the expression requires further research is a very telling way of everything being correlated with everything else. Jellett identified the principal modus operandi of future scientific positivism with its ambition to correlate everything with everything else. What was at stake, finally, in such a theoretical possibility was the unleashing of fresh anxieties about what could be known. These anxieties would sweep across the 20th century, less noticed and remarked upon than the anxieties created by politics and war during the first half of the century, but they would emerge in fuller force with rising prosperity and long-term peace in the second half. William James anticipated at the beginning of the 20th century why this interest in the efficacy of prayer would endure in the ostensible age of science. In his Gifford Lectures at England in 1901-1902, subsequently published as the great book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James addressed the controversy that brought scientists and clergymen into open conflict, not about Darwinism, but about prayer. He writes, "We have heard much talk of late against prayer, especially against prayers for better weather and for the recovery of sick people. As regards prayer for the sick, if any medical fact can be considered to stand firm, it is that in certain environments, prayer may contribute to recovery and should be encouraged as a therapeutic measure. Being a normal factor of moral health in the person, its omission would be deleterious." James obviously elided the question of whether there were differences in praying for oneself or for others, but it mattered less in the therapeutic realm than in the scientific one. In the therapeutic realm, the idea of moral health encompassed a much broader range of possible measures beyond those tested and confirmed scientifically. What James achieved in a few short sentences was a disengagement with the intellectual questions that scientists a quarter century before had chosen to raise against organized religion. Outside the laboratory and in the world of human encounters, the questions about cause and effect were less easy to disentangle, and so the answers were more varied and personal. Yet anxiety about illness and death, mediated by a trustworthy doctor, has not disappeared. And in fact, in the past 50 years, every 10 years or so, the prayer test gets restudied. It gets reinvented. In my book, I think I cite those studies. So this brings me to what I consider an interesting case that addresses the public reputation of physicians, where this anxiety about illness and death still operates, particularly as physicians come to be expected to reflect on larger cultural ideals and values whose inheritance has been religious. And so I'm going to talk now in conclusion about an unusual incident that affected the great William Osler. A physician's opinion about death in the face of a corporate enterprise devoted to forestalling it reveals something about the way in which physicians historically achieved an ambivalent trust from those who sought them out. Until very recent times, except in the case of physician-assisted suicide, the medical profession has avoided as much as possible any perception about playing an active role in hastening death, or accepting it, or advocating for it before its time. Part of the historic function of the golden age of medicine, then, was to maintain a clear demarcation in the public mind between death and its gatekeepers. It was thus a rare occasion indeed that some form of public ridicule of physicians and their connection to death in particular reached the front page of the newspaper. A spectacular and thus revealing instance occurred upon the occasion of William Osler's departure from the Johns Hopkins University in 1905. Osler is regarded as the doctor's doctor, and his name remains synonymous with humanistic medicine in the early days of its golden age. He was in every sense an iconic figure, larger than life, and an embodiment of vocation and dedication. Osler's appointment at Hopkins as professor of medicine began in 1889, where he remained for 16 years. He was instrumental in the founding and subsequent fame of the medical school there, and it was during this time that his reputation increased greatly. In 1904, he accepted the Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford and left Hopkins on May 15, 1905. How and why was it then that for a brief period he was widely regarded as an advocate of forced retirement and euthanasia? Various analyses of the specific incident that led to the ridiculing of Osler's reputation have been written defensively. They blame journalists, but take little notice of what the widespread upset may have revealed about the public's perception of doctors. The canonical account is given by Harvey Cushing in The Life of Sir William Osler. In preparing for his final address to his Hopkins colleagues in February 1905, Osler selected the title, The Fixed Period, after Anthony Trollope's novel of the same name. The novel, published in 1882 at the end of Trollope's life, is set in 1980 and recounts the imaginary country of Britannula, where the citizens pass a law whose purpose is to rid themselves of the infirmities of old age by fixing an exact age when all people should be euthanized. Although Trollope may have been satirizing the lack of human sympathy of the vast array of reformers of his day, he was not unsympathetic to the boldly stated goals of advocates of human progress, who throughout the 1870s had rattled the sensibilities of religious leaders in England. He joined forces with that element of British religious skepticism whose claims to authority were built on pointing out the limits of faith in public life. It is true that Osler may have not considered that his use of Trollope's satirical novel might be taken more literally by a gullible and naturally sensationalist press. He proposed that most men were relatively useless after the age of 40, having done all their important work between 25 and 40, and that his own fixed idea was what an incalculable benefit it would be in commercial, political, and in professional life if men over 60 stopped working altogether. So he said in his address, "In that charming novel, The Fixed Period, Anthony Trollope discusses the practical advantages in modern life of a return to this ancient usage, and the plot hinges upon the admirable scheme of a college into which at 60 men retired for a year of contemplation before a peaceful departure by chloroform. It's actually, Osler had it incorrect in Trollope's novel. It was by opening up the veins. Well, the reaction in newspapers to Osler's address were thunderous, leading him to speak out in his own defense on the front page of the New York Times. 5 days after his address, following numerous news reports with headlines such as "Useless at 40," and Professor Osler recommends all at 60 to be chloroformed, Osler responded, he says, "I have been so misquoted in the papers that I should like to make the following statement. First, I did not say that men at 60 should be chloroformed. That was the point in the novel to which I referred and on which the plot hinged. Second, nothing in the criticisms have shaken my conviction that the telling work of the world has been done and is done by men under 40 years of age. The exceptions which have been given only illustrate the rule. Thirdly, it would be for the general good if men at 60 were relieved from active work. We should miss the energies of some young old men, but on the whole, it would be of the greatest service to those 60 and older themselves." Osler's insistence that he was primarily misunderstood and that Trollope's ideas were Trollope's and not his allowed him to distance himself from the more hyperbolic claims that he endorsed the idea of literally disposing of old age. In the third edition of his deservedly famous book of essays, Equanimitas, Osler wrote from England that, "To one who had all his life been devoted to old men, it was not a little distressing to be placarded in a worldwide way as their sworn enemy, and to every man over 60, whose spirit I may have thus unwittingly bruised, I tender my heartfelt regrets." Let me add, however, that the discussion which followed my remarks has not changed, but has rather strengthened my belief that the real work of life is done before the 40th year, and that after the 60th year it would be best for the world and best for themselves if men rested from their labors. It's impossible from such a distance in time to estimate the effects of Osler's remarks on the public, however much they may have been taken out of context. He rationalized, for example, that newspapers might have been having their own fun at his expense. 12 days before his departure from America, the New York Times published a cartoon depicting old men coming out from hiding as Osler walks off in the distance toward Oxford. His impression that the papers did have some fun at his expense was not unreasonable. However, a few reports appeared of people committing suicide, their bodies found with news clippings of Osler's address nearby. His apology to every man over 60 and his continued insistence about the rightfulness of his views about aging raise an interesting problem about the role of professional advice, individual and corporate, especially in the light of association of reports of suicide as a result of his remarks. It is entirely possible that a few older people took his words to heart. That is, they recognized the diminution of their own powers along with their social standing. Of course, Osler was a social prescription, a statement of public policy, rather than a form of individual counsel. He failed to recognize the powerful connection in some minds between his authority as a physician with patients in his care and the meaning of his words outside that context to those not in his immediate care, but who accepted his wisdom as a physician. In so failing, he illustrates one of the profoundest dilemmas of where the line is drawn between personal responsibility and public good. I'm almost done. Another problem emerges from this cautionary tale in terms of the meaning of anecdotes and statistics. Osler based his social pronouncements on a literary text, a flight from a social reality which itself was captured, distorted, and sometimes missed in Trollope's imaginary musings. The missing part was reiterated in the newspapers in the form of examples of old people still vital and productive. Osler dismissed these examples as being exceptions to the rule, thus proving it. He never gave up his conviction that institutional mechanisms must be used to make room for the young and vigorous. The arguments he provoked here continued to inspire debates about retirement, now an accepted concept, and euthanasia, two things lately that seem to have been separated in the public mind. That is, retirement and euthanasia. But the late physician, Jack Kevorkian, whether or not he knew of Osler or Trollope, called attention to the question of whose authority it is, in principle and in practice, to give and take away life. Appeals to a mixed anecdotal testimony and relentlessly gathered statistical overviews have put not only the matter of principle out of focus, but also the lived reality in which physicians and patients encounter one another. Concern about the rhetoric of death panels, however righteous the condemnation of such rhetoric may be, obscures the question about how to address the anxieties at the end of life and why that question transcends both science and politics. It's one of the reasons, I think, why we gather here together today. I conclude with a brief reflection on why the two examples I've reviewed today are part of a larger cultural struggle through which we can observe the transcendent powers of medicine as they are expressed in the limits of the scientific worldview and the moral authority embodied in the character and responsibilities of the physician. The prayer gauge debate goes on endlessly in the pursuit of more precise calibrations of cause and effect that define the goals of clinical epidemiology. It is no longer prayer's efficacy that is at stake, but rather the effects of all manner of things on the human organism, a preoccupation that has had a curious impact on the ways in which the demands of public health have slowly but inevitably come to challenge communities of faith. At the same time, some physicians find themselves in untenable positions with respect to their own faith traditions as they navigate how to respond to the evolving claims of medical science itself. Claims about the separation of church and state have long obscured the cultural inheritance of our faith traditions in the public square. And here I recommend a book by Philip Hamburger called The Separation of Church and State, published by Harvard a number of years ago. In my most recent work, I'm trying to delineate more carefully how these inheritance pertain to present difficulties, which remain always difficult and always present. Thank you.